Hi, Rotaract. It's lovely to talk to you today. I think I know a few of the people in the room, and to those of you who I don't know, it's nice to be able to talk to you today. My name's Aden, and I'm currently living in Arusha, northern Tanzania, which is a bit of a wild ride. And I've sent through some proposals to you for how you might be able to support an NGO that I'm here working with called the Umoja Centre. The proposals have quite a bit of detail in them, but what I wanted to do today was to provide a little bit more context of the centre itself, and then where the need came from that led me to conceive of those two proposals. So the Umoja Centre's been around since about 2008, and it emerged out of an identified need, a need identified by our founder, Caroline Goody, for a program for disengaged youth. So lots of really cool, interesting stuff happening in Arusha in the NGO space, but not a lot for students or young people that have fallen out of education and employment. So smart, bright, capable young people, motivated, but not currently employed and not currently in education. So what Umoja does is for 50 of these students at any given time, we provide a one-year intensive program that's intended to get them back into education or back into employment. And it does that not just by providing an education, but by providing sort of a holistic wraparound service, everything that these young people might need to kind of get them back on their feet. So that includes like psychosocial support through a social worker, healthy meals, and for some of these youth, this might be the only meal they're getting for the day. Outplacement support when they graduate, careers guidance, enterprise training, sexual health education, which is a huge gap here because none of the churches want to touch it. And the idea is they get this whole kind of thing over a year, and then they go back into secondary education, vocational training, or employment. And the program, I mean, I've only been here 2 months, but it's a tremendously successful, really tightly run project, getting some amazing outcomes. So a full 95% of our graduates are now in full-time employment. Many are in the sort of highly coveted safari and hospitality sector here, which Arusha is the gateway to Ngorongoro Crater, Serengeti, and Kilimanjaro. So it's a huge source of employment here, and yeah, many of our students end up there. A full 20% of our students go into tertiary education, which is bloody huge, because here only maybe 1 or 2% of students end up going to university. So we're getting some amazing outcomes with these really vulnerable youth, getting them into quite good education and employment outcomes. Like a lot of NGOs, the Umoja Centre is pretty much essentially 100% dependent on private philanthropy, grants, and community groups to do the work it does. It's on a very small budget, about 200,000 Australian a year, but here 200,000 Australian gets you 11 staff and lets you provide this full service for 50 kids. So it just shows how far the money goes here. But this sort of 100% dependence on philanthropy, which, you know, most of you would probably know because we're having this conversation in Australia as well, is a bit of a challenge. And these days, NGOs, non-profits, are looking to diversify their revenue sources by starting social enterprises. So Umoja currently has a small one, making and selling curios to the tourist market, so stuffed elephants, bags, that kind of thing. And it's turning over a modest profit of about 600 Australian a year. It's a decent profit rate, but it's in real terms, it's quite small. And that's very much where I come in. So the Umoja Centre spoke with Australian Volunteers International, who are subcontracted to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to place people like myself all over the world doing good work for various NGOs. The goal of my position here is to accelerate that social enterprise dimension of the NGO. So I've been doing a fair bit of work in that regard in terms of getting a better understanding of how good ideas grow and how to support emerging businesses here, building in innovation in pedagogy and teaching, all sorts of stuff. But there's one thing I can't do, which is any sort of commercial venture in the context of an NGO, so a social enterprise, carries with it an element of risk. So when you're an NGO and you're delivering a very tight service on a very small budget, it's often quite hard to justify why you should go and spend $500 or $1,000 on a sewing machine, not even fully aware if it's going to be a worthwhile investment. And even if it is, it's not necessarily the case that you can afford to lose $500 now in order to make $2,000 in 2 years' time. And similarly, even with our current quite successful business, which is turning about $600 Australian a year, the ability to reinvest those profits is quite minimal, and it makes it very hard to scale good ideas. So testing new ideas and scaling good ideas is very difficult due to the fact that your budget is mostly spent keeping the lights on, keeping your staff paid, and keeping the kids fed. So because of that, it's quite a risk-averse environment. So that's very much where both of the proposals came from, is the opportunity to, we're looking for an opportunity to access some funds to kind of get businesses out of that research and high-risk stage to the point where they're quite mature and self-sustaining. So I kind of see it as like, shoving a canoe out in the water until it gets to the point where it can row on its own momentum kind of thing. That's probably a bad metaphor. You can think of a better one. So that's the social enterprise program in general, and we have had some success with that sort of initial funding boost model in the existing Curio business. That was started with a £1,700 grant from a Rotary Club in the UK called Broughton, if I'm pronouncing that right. And that got us to a point where that enterprise no longer needs any money injected. Now, additional funding would allow us to scale it more quickly, but even without that, it's a good, profitable business on its own. So we kind of see it as a number about 4,000 Australian is enough for us to build one successful sort of social enterprise. And then we have the separate proposal for the sanitary pads project, which is really, really exciting. I mean, the potential impact here is enormous, owing largely to the fact that although this is quite a well-known problem, the problem being that girls are disproportionately unable to access school due to a lack of affordable products to buy during their period. And yeah, that means that girls are missing out on some 45 days of school a year by some measures. And there's a number of interesting models that have come to address this problem, but so far none in Tanzania. And we've had a bit of experience making some pads and distributing them to our students, but we really want to experiment with scaling it to see if we can reach a wider audience. Now, part of the reason that's a separate proposal is as part of what we're trying to do at Umoja is to build profitable enterprises that can support the core work we're doing. But the social need for the sanitary pads is so high that we'd really like to run that as what's called a lockstep enterprise. So basically relax that need for profitability. It only needs to make enough money to sustain itself, and that lets us really focus on the impact. So again, it's that sort of de-risking thing. So huge potential there, and that's why we're sort of regarding that as a separate proposal. It's a little bit out of the framework and the objectives of the other stuff. Now, I guess the thing with these two proposals is, you run into this issue a little bit in social enterprise, I suppose, is that really we're asking for support for a process of developing business rather than specific ideas. Anyone who's in the commercial world would know that you can't plan out a project to the nth detail. You have to do it kind of iteratively. You use feedback and research to change the product as time goes on. So I've put the innovation framework forward as part of both proposals, and I'd really welcome your scrutiny on that. Which probably brings me to my last point, which is quite an important one. I really, really do, and I mean this totally legit, I really welcome your scrutiny and your questions on these proposals. I made a blog post about maybe a month or 6 weeks ago about in this part of the world, really, a dollar goes a lot further than it does back home. So if you were donating $20,000 to a local NGO in Australia, you might get a project officer on a part-time basis, and the funds are sort of dispersed over a year. But here, that amount of money is going to quite likely cover several livelihoods and have a really significant impact on the NGO. Which isn't to say, there's a kind of Singer-esque argument for therefore donating all your money to Africa, but I think it means you need a proportionately higher level of scrutiny, because hiring more people means that we're creating livelihoods, and we wouldn't want to create something that has to be taken away in the future due to mismanagement. So that's why in the innovation process framework that I've sent through, there's this external supporters check, which is basically, even if Rotary chooses to support us, at the point where a project is looking mature, and we at Umoja are thinking, we'd really like to seriously invest in this by either hiring a staff member or buying some capital or investing in training, we'd really appreciate having Rotaract there to really give us some feedback on the idea. To be able to say, have you thought about this, or have you caught up with these people or something? I'm pretty open as to what form that could take, but I suppose what I'm saying is that your professional expertise, your scrutiny, and your time matters as much as the financial contribution would. I really see them as being quite locked together, so I really welcome that. And I guess that really exemplifies the whole proposal, which is to say, I hope it's the start of a relationship between the Umoja Centre and Rotaract. Obviously, I don't know if this was mentioned, but I'm a Perth boy, so I will be back at some point, and we'll be able to report on this and how we're doing. I hope that these proposals could be the start of a really productive and good long-term relationship between the club and some of the great stuff, really exciting stuff happening here in Tanzania. So thank you all for your time. I do welcome your questions. Dan and Renu might be able to answer some, but if there are any hairy ones, they can forward them on to me, and I can have some responses ready for your next meeting. And the clouds have just come over. All right. It was lovely to talk to you all, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the future.